My name is Stella. The dawn did not break, it bruised the sky. It was that specific, fragile hour of the morning when the world hangs suspended between the black of night and the gray of waking, a time usually reserved for the innocent or the restless. Stella belonged to the former, or so she thought, as she navigated her car through the empty, dew-slick streets. The rhythm of the tires against the asphalt was a hypnotic hum, a lullaby that contrasted with the flutter of anticipation beating against her ribs. She had left her mother's house hours earlier than planned, driven by a foolish, romantic impulse that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. Her mother's health had stabilized, the fever breaking in the middle of the night, and Stella, exhausted but relieved, had seized the opportunity to return to her own sanctuary. She wanted to wake Adam. She wanted to slip into the warmth of their bed while the sheets were still heavy with sleep, to press her cold nose against his shoulder and feel him groan, shift, and pull her in. It was a domestic fantasy, simple and profound, the kind of moment that anchored a marriage when the years began to drift. On the passenger seat lay a bouquet of white lilies, purchased from a 24-hour grocer on the edge of town. They were Adam's favorites, or perhaps they were hers, and he had simply adopted them over time. The boundaries of their preferences had blurred so thoroughly over 7 years that she could no longer tell where she ended and he began. The flowers were wrapped in crinkling brown paper, their scent sharp and green, filling the car with the smell of earth and rain. Turning into their driveway, the house loomed like a sleeping beast, dark and silent. It was a beautiful home, a structure of brick and ivy that they had worked so hard to afford, a testament to Adam's ambition and Stella's unwavering support. But as the headlights swept across the facade, something felt disjointed. It wasn't a visual cue, the windows were dark, the lawn pristine, but a frequency in the air, a disruption in the stillness that prickled the fine hairs on the back of her neck. Stella cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The ticking of the cooling motor sounded like a countdown. She shook off the unease, attributing it to the lack of sleep and the emotional drain of nursing her mother. Grabbing the lilies, she stepped out into the chill. The morning air was biting, sinking through her coat, nipping at her exposed wrists. It was the kind of cold that clarified things, making the edges of the world seem sharper, harder. She unlocked the front door with practiced quiet, the key turning in the tumbler with a soft, metallic click that echoed too loudly in her own ears. Inside, the house was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and the expensive cologne Adam wore like armor. But beneath that familiar scent, there was something else, a foreign note, sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit or cheap vanilla. It hung in the foyer, alien and intrusive. Stella frowned, pausing at the foot of the stairs. Her shoes, sensible flats chosen for the drive, made no sound on the plush runner as she began to ascend. Every step was a question she was afraid to answer. Why did the house feel so occupied? Usually, when Adam was alone, the house felt dormant, waiting for her to breathe life back into it. Today, it felt like it was hiding something. It felt complicit. The hallway on the second floor was a tunnel of shadows. The door to the guest room was closed. The door to the study was ajar, revealing the blinking green light of the router in the darkness. And at the end of the hall, the master bedroom door stood open by a fraction, a slice of darkness interrupting the white wood. Stella moved towards it, the lilies crinkling softly in her grip. Her heart began a slow, heavy thudding, a war drum announcing an unwanted battle. She reached the door and pushed it. It swung open on well-oiled hinges, silent as a breath. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the sheer curtains, casting the room in a spectral, blue-gray haze. It was enough. It was more than enough. The scene before her was not chaotic. It was not a scene of violent passion or disarray. It was terrifyingly domestic. Two figures lay entangled in the center of the bed she had chosen, the mattress she had rotated last week, the sheets she had washed with lavender detergent. Adam was on his back, one arm thrown carelessly over his head, his mouth slightly open in deep, remorseless sleep. And curled against him, her head resting in the crook of his shoulder where Stella had envisioned herself only moments ago, was a woman. Stella stopped. The world did not spin, it stopped. Time did not slow down, it evaporated. She knew the woman. It wasn't a stranger picked up from a bar, a faceless entity she could dismiss as a moment of weakness. It was Anna. Anna, with her dark hair splayed across Stella's pillow like ink spilled on snow. Anna, who had sat at their dining table 3 weeks ago, laughing at Adam's jokes, drinking their wine, complimenting Stella on the roast chicken. Anna, the consultant. The friend. The intimacy of it was a physical blow. It was the comfort of their posture that eviscerated Stella more than the nudity. They looked like they belonged together. They looked like a habit. Adam's hand rested possessively on Anna's hip, his fingers curled into her flesh as if anchoring himself to her. This wasn't a mistake, this was a routine. A scream rose in Stella's throat, a primal, jagged thing that wanted to tear the walls down. It wanted to shatter the windows, to wake the neighbors, to summon the gods of vengeance to witness this atrocity. She wanted to march over there and claw them apart, to scream until her vocal cords snapped, to demand, to accuse, to burn the house to the ground with the fire in her chest. But the scream never came. It died in her esophagus, choked off by a sudden, paralyzing realization of total powerlessness. If she screamed, she would be the hysterical wife. She would be the noise. She would be the chaos interrupting their peace. And looking at them, so calm, so settled in their treachery, she realized that her anger was a currency they did not deserve. The silence that followed was heavy, almost geological. It pressed against her eardrums, louder than any siren. It was the sound of a life breaking. It was the sound of 7 years of trust disintegrating into dust in a single second. She felt a physical detachment, as if her spirit were stepping back from her body to observe the wreckage from a safe distance. She looked at her hands, they were trembling, but her feet were rooted to the floor. She watched them. She watched the rise and fall of Adam's chest, the rhythm she had once tried to match her own breathing to. Now, it just looked like biology. He was just a man. A liar. A stranger wearing the skin of her husband. She looked at Anna, seeing the relaxed slackness of her face, the smugness that persisted even in sleep. The betrayal wasn't hot, it was ice cold. It froze the blood in Stella's veins. It clarified her vision. She saw the clothes scattered on the floor, Adam's trousers mixed with Anna's dress. She saw the empty wine glasses on the nightstand, the dregs of red wine drying at the bottom. They had celebrated. They had toasted to this. To her absence. The pain was a sharp, focused point in the center of her chest, a singularity that threatened to swallow her whole. But around that pain, a wall began to rise. A wall of necessity. If she woke them now, she would get lies. She would get apologies that meant nothing. She would get the messy, ugly, pathetic drama of a confrontation where she was the victim. She refused to be the victim. Not here. Not in the light of this cold sunrise. Her grip on the flowers loosened. The crinkling of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, but neither of the sleepers stirred. They were too arrogant in their safety, too assured that Stella was miles away, dutifully caring for her mother, playing the role of the good, oblivious wife. Stella looked at the lilies one last time. They looked ridiculous now. Corpse flowers. A funeral arrangement for a marriage that had died long before she walked through the door. The white petals seemed gray in the half-light, drained of their vitality. She didn't throw them. She didn't use them as a weapon. With a slow, deliberate movement, she opened her hand. The bouquet fell. It hit the thick carpet with a soft, muffled thud. It was a sound of finality. A period at the end of a sentence. Stella looked at the fallen flowers, then back at the bed. The tears finally welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, blurring the image of the husband she had loved. But she did not wipe them away, and she did not make a sound. She let the silence wrap around her like a shroud, turning her grief into something hard, something sharp, something that could be used. The sun was beginning to crest over the horizon outside, sending a beam of pale, unforgiving light across the floor, illuminating the betrayal in high definition. But Stella was no longer just watching. She was calculating. And the silence was no longer her prison, it was her weapon. Stella remained motionless, a statue carved from grief and frozen in the dim, morning light. The lilies lay at her feet like a discarded peace offering, their scent now mingling nauseatingly with the lingering aroma of the room. It was a sensory overload of the worst kind. To the world, the room might have looked peaceful, but to Stella, it was a crime scene where the victim was her own soul. Her mind began to perform a morbid autopsy on the life she thought she had, dissecting 7 years of devotion to find the exact moment the rot had set in. Her eyes, dry and burning, drifted to the foot of the bed. There, discarded carelessly over a chair, was her favorite silk robe. It was a deep, midnight blue, a gift her father had given her when she graduated from her master's program. It was more than a garment, it was a symbol of her identity, of a time when she was defined by her own achievements rather than her husband's needs. Now, it was a crumpled heap on the floor, likely used by Anna to walk through Stella's own kitchen, to drink from Stella's own mugs, to inhabit Stella's life while she was away. The sight of it felt like a physical violation, a jagged blade twisting in her gut. She could almost see the phantom image of Anna's skin against that silk, a thought that made bile rise in the back of her throat. On the nightstand sat a half-empty bottle of Silver Oak Cabernet, the vintage they were supposed to save for their upcoming anniversary. The 2 glasses beside it were stained with crimson rings, a mocking celebration of her absence. Stella remembered the day they bought that bottle. They had been in Napa, laughing under the sun, promising each other that they would open it when Adam finally made partner. She had worked 2 jobs during his final years of law school so he wouldn't have to worry about the mortgage. She had moved 3 times, abandoning her own burgeoning career in architectural design to follow his trajectory. Every sacrifice had been a brick laid in the foundation of his success, a foundation that he was now using to house his mistress. The anatomy of her heartbreak was composed of these small, sharp details. It was the way the pillows were arranged, not the way she liked them, but the way Anna clearly preferred. It was the discarded earring on the rug, a cheap, glittering thing that didn't belong in this room of understated elegance. It was the realization that while she was holding her mother's hand in a sterile hospital room, praying for a recovery, her husband was holding this woman, laughing at the freedom her absence provided. The pain was not a dull ache, it was a geometric precision of agony. It was sharp and jagged, like stepping on broken glass in the dark. Every memory of Adam's late nights at the office or his sudden business trips now replayed in her mind, recontextualized by the presence of the woman in her bed. The lies weren't just spoken, they were a lifestyle. She realized with a sickening clarity that she hadn't been a partner, she had been a facilitator. She was the steady hand that kept the house running, the emotional anchor that allowed him to drift into whatever storm he desired. She looked at Adam's face, searching for a trace of the man she had loved. He looked younger in sleep, stripped of the calculated charisma he wore in the light of day. But the softness she once found endearing now looked like weakness. He was a man who took the path of least resistance, a man who built a life on the labor of women. And Anna, Stella looked at her with a cold, clinical detachment. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a mirror, reflecting the parts of Adam that Stella had spent years trying to ignore. Anna was the shortcut, the easy thrill, the accomplice in a betrayal that felt far more expansive than a mere physical tryst. A single sob threatened to break through the iron wall of her chest. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, a desperate need to let out the howl that was vibrating in her bones. But she clenched her jaw until her teeth ached. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her noise. To sob was to admit defeat, to scream was to acknowledge that they still had the power to move her. She took a slow, shallow breath, feeling the cold air of the room settle in her lungs. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this house 20 minutes ago. That woman was dead, buried under the weight of the fallen lilies. She began to think of the trajectory Adam was so proud of. She had been the one to edit his briefs until 3 in the morning. She had been the one to network with the partners' wives, to curate the perfect image of a rising star spouse. She had dimmed her own light so that his could shine brighter, believing that their lights would eventually merge into a singular, brilliant future. What a pathetic, beautiful lie that had been. As she stood there, a strange, icy calm began to settle over her. The heat of the initial shock was being replaced by the structural integrity of a plan. She realized that she was still in the shadows, unobserved and unknown. She was a ghost in her own home, and a ghost has the unique advantage of being able to watch without being seen. Her gaze moved from the bed to the vanity in the corner of the room. It was a vintage piece they had found at an auction, a beautiful, mahogany desk where she used to write her journals. Now, it was cluttered with Anna's things, a designer handbag, a scattering of expensive makeup, and a laptop that glowed with a faint, pulsing blue light, indicating it was in sleep mode but not shut down. A new kind of curiosity, one fueled by survival rather than grief, began to stir in her. This wasn't just about a woman in a bed. There was an arrogance in the way they had taken over the room, a sense of permanent displacement that suggested they weren't just hiding, they were moving in. They were comfortable. Too comfortable. Stella took one last look at the woman wearing her robe and the man who had promised to cherish her. The jagged edges of her heart didn't soften, but they aligned. She wouldn't be the victim of a cliché. She wouldn't pack a bag in the middle of the night and flee to a hotel, leaving them to enjoy the spoils of their war. If they wanted her life, they would have to face the consequences of the secrets she was about to find. She turned away from the bed, her movements fluid and silent. The tears were still there, a shimmering veil in her eyes, but they did not fall. She moved toward the vanity, her heart beating with a new, dangerous rhythm. The 15-minute clock of her old life had run out, and the first minute of her new life was about to begin. She would find the truth, not because she wanted to be hurt more, but because she wanted to be free. And in this house of lies, the truth was the only thing that could burn it all down. It was not a conscious decision, not a command sent from her brain to her limbs, but a magnetic pull, a drift of debris in the wake of a shipwreck. She turned her back on the bed, on the tableau of betrayal that was burned onto her retinas like the afterimage of a solar eclipse, and floated toward the vanity. Her movements were fluid, spectral. She felt light, untethered, as if the gravity that held the rest of the world together had released her. The vanity table, an antique piece of rosewood she had found at an estate sale years ago, stood against the far wall, bathed in the gray, merciless light of the dawn. It had always been her altar, a space for the rituals of womanhood, the application of creams, the brushing of hair, the quiet moments of reflection before the performance of the day began. But now, as she approached, it looked like a stranger's desk. It had been colonized. Her objective was simple: escape. Her car keys sat on the corner of the polished wood, glinting dully next to a crystal perfume bottle that wasn't hers. If she took them, she could leave. She could walk back down the stairs, out the front door, and drive until the fuel ran out. She could vanish. She could become a missing person, a rumor, a cautionary tale. The temptation to erase herself was overwhelming, a seductive tug toward oblivion. To leave was to preserve the last shred of her dignity, to deny them the spectacle of her unraveling. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling slightly, hovering over the keys. The metal would be cold. The ignition would be loud. But then, freedom. But as her fingers brushed the jagged edge of the key fob, her gaze snagged on something else. It was an incongruity. A dissonance in the visual landscape of an illicit affair. Beside the scattered array of Anna's cosmetics, a tube of lipstick uncapped like a bloody bullet, a dusting of powder that looked like ash, sat a sleek, black leather folder. It was thick, corporate, and utterly out of place. It belonged in a boardroom, not a boudoir. Next to it, Anna's laptop sat open, the screen dark but the power light blinking a steady, rhythmic pulse. Why? The question was a hook, catching in Stella's throat. Why bring work to a tryst? Why ruin the fantasy of a stolen night with the banality of bureaucracy? Curiosity is a strange beast, it wakes up when the heart goes numb. The searing pain that had crippled Stella moments ago began to cool, hardening into a shell of icy suspicion. The tears that had blurred her vision receded, leaving her sight preternaturally clear. She looked at the bed. Adam shifted, a low, guttural snore vibrating in his chest. Anna murmured something unintelligible, nuzzling deeper into the pillow. They were oblivious, drunk on their own arrogance, safe in the assumption that Stella was miles away, weeping over a sick mother. They were so sure of her. So sure of her predictability. So sure of her blindness. That arrogance was the spark. It ignited a cold, white flame in Stella's chest. She didn't pick up the keys. Instead, her hand drifted to the leather folder. The leather was cool and smooth under her fingertips. It smelled of expensive tanning agents and something sharper, like ink. She opened it. The cover made a soft creak, a sound that seemed to thunder in the silence of the room, causing Stella to freeze. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. On the bed, Adam turned over, flinging an arm out. The movement was heavy, final. He settled again. The rhythm of the room resumed. Stella exhaled, a long, shaky breath that she pushed out through her nose. She looked down at the documents. The first page was a standard non-disclosure agreement. Dry. Legal. Boring. But the names were wrong. It wasn't between Adam's firm and a client. It was between a shell company she had never heard of, Vantage Holdings, and a name that made the blood drain from her face, Stella's father. Her father? Her brow furrowed. Her father was a retired schoolteacher, a man whose financial life consisted of a modest pension and a fervent dedication to his garden. What business did he have with a holding company? And why was this document here, in her bedroom, next to the woman sleeping with her husband? She turned the page. The paper rustled, a dry whisper of secrets being exhaled. The next document was a transfer of deed. A property transfer. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the heretofores and whereas, blurring until she hit the bolded text. It was the deed to her parents' house. The house she grew up in. The house she had just left. It was being signed over to Vantage Holdings as collateral. Collateral for what? A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air seized her. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just sex. Sex was messy, emotional, human. This was math. This was calculation. This was a blueprint. She looked at the date at the bottom of the page. It was dated for tomorrow. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The betrayal she had walked in on was merely the surface tension of a much deeper, darker ocean. She looked at the laptop. It sat there like a monolith, a black box recording the flight data of her crashing marriage. She needed to see what was inside. She tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, a sudden explosion of brightness that made Stella flinch. She instinctively shielded the screen with her body, casting a shadow to prevent the light from washing over the sleeping figures on the bed. The glare stung her eyes, accustomed to the dark. The screen was locked. Of course. But Stella knew Adam. She knew his habits, his laziness, his reliance on patterns. And she knew that Anna, for all her sleek sophistication, was likely just as creaturely. She tried Adam's birthday. Incorrect. She tried password. Incorrect. She paused, thinking. What would a narcissist use? What would a woman who thought she had won the prize use? She typed in Adam. The screen unlocked. The simplicity of it was insulting. It was a testament to how little they feared her, how little they thought she was capable of uncovering. They didn't think she was smart enough to look, let alone crack a code a child could guess. The desktop was a clutter of files, but one folder stood out, saved directly on the center of the screen. It was labeled simply, the exit strategy. Stella stared at the words. Exit strategy. It was a business term, cold and efficient. It implied a termination of a venture. A liquidation of assets. And she, Stella, was the asset being liquidated. She glanced at the digital clock in the corner of the screen. 5:15 a.m. Adam's alarm was set for 5:30 a.m. He was a creature of routine. He would wake up, shower, and pretend to go to work, leaving his mistress to slip out the back door. She had 15 minutes. 15 minutes before the simulation of her life resumed. 15 minutes before the man she married woke up and put on his mask. 15 minutes to transition from the wife who was cheated on to the woman who knew everything. The panic that had been fluttering in her chest suddenly stilled. It was replaced by a strange, hyper-focused clarity. The adrenaline that flooded her system wasn't the flight or fight response of a prey animal, it was the predatory focus of a hunter who has just spotted the weakness in the beast. She wasn't going to leave. She wasn't going to take the keys and drive into the sunrise. That would be a mercy they didn't deserve. That would be giving them the narrative. Poor Stella, she couldn't handle the truth. No. She was going to stay. She was going to take these 15 minutes and she was going to dismantle them, piece by piece, file by file, signature by signature. She looked back at the bed one last time. Adam was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm that belied the violence of his actions. He looked so vulnerable. So exposed. He had no idea that the woman standing 10 feet away was no longer his wife. She was his judge, his jury, and in exactly 15 minutes, she would be his executioner. Stella turned back to the screen, her fingers hovering over the trackpad. The grief was gone, evaporated by the heat of the revelation. All that was left was the work. She clicked on the folder. The clock was ticking. And for the first time that morning, Stella didn't feel like crying. She felt like working. She had expected emails. She had braced herself for the tawdry, humiliating digital detritus of a modern affair, reservations for hotels she couldn't afford, receipts for lingerie that wasn't hers, threads of messages filled with inside jokes and cruel dismissals of her existence. She was prepared to see her marriage reduced to a series of clandestine calendar invites. That was the script she knew, that was the heartbreak she had rehearsed in the dark hours of the night when Adam didn't come home. But the screen did not show her love letters. It showed her spreadsheets. Rows and columns of data stretched across the display, a grid of numbers that looked dry and impenetrable to the uninitiated eye. But Stella was not uninitiated. Before she was a wife, before she was a caretaker, she had managed the books for her father's small hardware store. She knew how money moved. She knew how it left trails like a slug moving across concrete. And here, glowing in the blue light of the laptop, was a highway of sludge. The file name at the top of the spreadsheet was innocuous, Project Horizon, Q1. But the content was a massacre. Stella's eyes scanned the columns, her brain struggling to reconcile the figures with the man sleeping 10 feet away. Transfers. Massive, recurring transfers. $50,000 here. $80,000 there. All of it siphoned from the operating accounts of Adam's law firm, accounts she knew were strictly for client escrow, and funneled into a singular destination. Vantage Holdings, Cayman. The name echoed in her mind. Vantage. Perspective. A view from above. It was a joke. A sick, private joke between thieves. Stella felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the affair. This wasn't just infidelity, this was larceny. This was federal prison. She looked at Adam, his mouth slightly open, a line of drool escaping onto the pillowcase. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a criminal. The realization shifted the ground beneath her feet. The betrayal of her heart suddenly felt small, almost quaint, compared to the betrayal of the law, of his partners, of the very oath he had sworn. But as she clicked through the subfolders, the nausea turned into a cold, vibrating horror. There was a PDF titled Consultancy Agreement. She opened it. It was a contract between the firm and Anna's consulting agency. The scope of work was vague: strategic oversight, client retention analysis, corporate speak for doing absolutely nothing. But the monthly retainer was staggering. Anna wasn't just a mistress, she was a payroll line item. She was the vessel. Adam wasn't spending money on her, he was washing money through her. The silk robes, the dinners, the business trips, they were all tax-deductible expenses in a grand scheme of embezzlement. The affair was a smokescreen. The sex was just the handshake. Stella's hand shook as she scrolled down. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. They had been draining the firm dry for 18 months. 18 months. That was around the time Adam had started complaining about market volatility and tight margins, cutting back on their household budget, telling Stella they couldn't afford a vacation, couldn't afford a new car, couldn't afford the fertility treatments they had discussed. He hadn't been saving money. He had been stealing it. She clicked on a folder named Liability Structure. The title alone was chilling. In the corporate world, liability was a hot potato. You didn't want to hold it when the music stopped. You wanted to pass it to someone else. Someone expendable. The document that opened was a draft of a confession. A statement of responsibility for the misappropriated funds. It was written in legalese, dense and accusatory, outlining a narrative where a rogue employee, or external contractor, had manipulated the accounts without the partner's knowledge. And then she saw the name. It wasn't Adam's name. It wasn't Anna's. It was Arthur Vance. The air left the room. The silence, which had been heavy before, now felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of Stella's lungs. Arthur Vance. Her father. Her father, the retired history teacher who spent his days tending to his prize-winning roses and reading biographies of Churchill. Her father, who still balanced his checkbook with a pencil and a calculator he had owned since 1995. Her father, the most honest man she had ever known, whose only crime was loving his daughter too much and trusting the man she married. Stella stared at the screen, her vision tunneling. The document was a masterpiece of fiction. It detailed a series of investments made by Arthur Vance, acting as a portfolio manager for a shell company linked to the firm. It had his social security number. It had his address. It had scanned copies of his signature, shaky, elderly signatures that Stella recognized from birthday cards and checks. They had forged them. Or worse, they had tricked him. She remembered now. 6 months ago. Adam had gone over to her parents' house to help her father with his estate planning. He had brought a stack of papers. Just standard stuff, Arthur. Just to make sure Stella is taken care of if anything happens to you. Sign here. And here. And here. Her father had signed. He had signed away his life because he thought he was protecting hers. A sound escaped Stella's throat, a low, animal whimper. She clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down on her knuckles until she tasted copper. The cruelty of it was absolute. They weren't just stealing money, they were setting up a scapegoat. When the missing millions were eventually noticed, and they would be, Adam wouldn't be the one in handcuffs. It would be Arthur. Poor, confused Arthur, with his dementia, a diagnosis Adam had subtly started hinting at during Sunday dinners, and his misguided attempt to grow the family fortune. It was the perfect crime. Who would suspect the grieving son-in-law? Adam would play the victim. He would cry in court about how his father-in-law had abused his trust. He would probably even offer to pay back a fraction of the money, out of his own pocket, to save face, securing his reputation as a saint while her father rotted in a cell or died of shame. And then she saw the final piece of the puzzle. The signature on the witness line of the forged confession. James Jimmy O'Connell. Jimmy. Adam's partner. The man who had danced at their wedding. The man who came to their barbecues and drank their beer and called Stella, kiddo. Jimmy wasn't a victim of this embezzlement. He was a co-conspirator. The web wasn't just in this bedroom. It spanned the entire firm. Adam and Jimmy were eating the company from the inside out, and they had chosen the Vance family as the carcass to leave behind. Stella looked up from the screen. The room looked different now. The bed didn't look like a place of infidelity, it looked like a war room. Adam didn't look like a cheating husband, he looked like a predator. A monster who had slept in her bed, eaten her food, and methodically planned the destruction of the only man who had ever loved her unconditionally. The grief that had been threatening to drown her evaporated instantly. It was burned away by a white-hot flash of clarity. There was no room for sadness in a slaughterhouse. There was only survival. She looked at the clock. 5:20 a.m. 10 minutes left. 10 minutes before the monster woke up. 10 minutes before the machinery of their plan clicked into its final gear. Her hands, which had been shaking, went still. They were cold, dead things, instruments of necessary violence. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't unlock it to call her mother. She didn't unlock it to call a friend. She opened the camera app. She didn't take a picture of the lovers in bed. That was irrelevant now. That was petty. She turned the lens toward the screen. Click. The spreadsheet. Click. The consultancy agreement. Click. The wire transfers to the Caymans. Click. The draft confession with her father's forged signature. Click. Jimmy's witnessing signature. She moved with the efficiency of a forensic photographer. Every image was a nail in a coffin. Every document was a bar in a cell. She wasn't gathering evidence for a divorce, she was gathering evidence for an indictment. She saw a flash drive sticking out of the side of the laptop. A small, silver thing. She reached out and pulled it. The laptop chimed, a soft, generic sound acknowledging the removal of hardware. Stella froze. On the bed, Anna stirred. She moaned softly, shifting her leg, the silk sheet slipping down to reveal her shoulder. She turned her head, her eyes fluttering. Stella stopped breathing. She stood perfectly still in the gray light, the flash drive burning a hole in her palm, the phone clutched in her other hand like a grenade. If Anna woke up now, it was over. The game would change. There would be shouting, denial, violence. Adam would wake up. He would realize the laptop was open. He would see what she had seen. He was bigger than her. Stronger. And a man desperate enough to frame his own father-in-law was a man desperate enough to do anything. Anna's eyes opened. A sliver of white showed beneath her lashes. She looked directly at the vanity. Stella didn't move. She didn't blink. She became a part of the furniture, a shadow in the corner of the room. Anna's gaze was unfocused, glassy with sleep. She smacked her lips, mumbled something that sounded like water, and then rolled over, burying her face back into the pillow. Stella let out the breath she had been holding in a silent, shuddering stream. She was safe. For now. But the clock was screaming in her head. 5 minutes had passed in the blink of an eye. She had the photos. She had the drive. But she needed more. She needed to make sure that when the hammer fell, it fell on all of them. She looked at the sent folder in the email client. There was one more thing she needed to check. The communication with the bank. The confirmation that the funds had cleared. She clicked. And there it was. An email from the Cayman Bank, dated yesterday. Funds received. Account active. Transfer to secondary holdings initiated. Secondary holdings? She opened the attachment. The secondary holding wasn't an account. It was a purchase order. For a villa in Osprey. A non-extradition country. They weren't just stealing. They were leaving. Today. The suitcases in the hallway closet. She hadn't checked them, but she knew now. They would be packed. This wasn't a morning after, it was the morning of. They were going to wake up, go to work, and never come back. They were going to leave her with a gutted bank account, a framed father, and a destroyed life. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting against a deadline that was hours, maybe minutes, away. Stella closed the email. She returned the laptop to the exact screen she had found it on, the desktop. She wiped the trackpad with her sleeve to remove her fingerprints. She placed the flash drive in her pocket. She stepped back. The vanity looked untouched. The room looked peaceful. But inside Stella, a war had begun. The heartbreak was gone, replaced by a terrifying, singular purpose. She looked at Adam one last time. He looked so small now. So finite. He thought he was the author of this story. He thought he was the one holding the pen. He was wrong. Stella turned toward the door. She had 5 minutes left. And she knew exactly how she was going to spend them. She wasn't leaving. She was going to wait. She was going to be the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes. She was going to be the dawn that burned him to ash. Stella's hand hovered over the green icon of the messaging app. It was a reflex, a digital muscle memory born of a decade of shared devices and open passwords. Adam had always been careless with his privacy, an arrogance born of the belief that Stella was too trusting, too soft, to ever snoop. He treated her lack of suspicion not as a gift, but as a weakness to be exploited. She clicked the icon. The window opened, populating with a stream of threads. Most were mundane, group chats with college friends, logistics with the firm's secretary. But pinned to the top, active as recently as 2 a.m., was a thread with Jimmy. Jimmy. The man who had toasted them at their rehearsal dinner, raising a glass of champagne to love that endures. The man who had held Stella's hand at her grandmother's funeral when Adam was stuck in court. Jimmy wasn't just a partner, he was family. He was the godfather to the children they hadn't had yet. Stella scrolled up, past the vulgar jokes and the casual misogyny that seemed to constitute the bulk of their friendship. She was looking for dates. She was looking for the timeline of the murder of her life. She found it. And it was worse than money. It was worse than sex. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. Jimmy, did you get the signature? The bank is pushing for the guarantor validation. Adam, done. Went over there last night. The old man was confused, but he signed. I told him it was a tax shield for the grandkids. Jimmy, nice. But we need a witness. A non-beneficiary. Someone clean. Stella's breath hitched. A clean witness. Someone whose testimony would stand up in court when the embezzlement was discovered. Someone who would unknowingly validate the lie that Arthur Vance had stolen the money himself. Adam, I handled it. Sarah came by to drop off some books for Stella. I caught her in the kitchen. Jimmy, Sarah? The sister? You're kidding. Is she solid? Adam, she's 22, Jimmy. She thinks I hung the moon. I told her it was an updated life insurance policy for Stella, and I needed a witness signature so Stella wouldn't see the premium increase. Played the doting husband card. She practically cried. Said I was so thoughtful. Jimmy, you're a sick bastard. I love it. So we're clear? Adam, we're clear. She signed the witness line on the asset transfer forms. If the feds ever look at it, it's airtight. The daughter witnessed the father moving the funds. It looks like a family conspiracy. Jimmy, and the girl? Adam, collateral damage. If it blows up, she didn't read what she signed. She's the patsy. Plausible deniability. The world did not tilt, it disintegrated. Stella stared at the glowing text, the white letters on the blue background burning themselves into her cerebral cortex. Sarah. Her baby sister. The girl Stella had practically raised when their mother went back to work. The girl whose hair Stella had braided before her first day of kindergarten. The girl who had looked at Adam with wide, worshipping eyes, seeing him as the big brother she never had. They hadn't just come for her marriage. They hadn't just come for her father's savings. They had come for Sarah's innocence. They had weaponized her sister's love to destroy her father. A sound ripped through Stella's mind, a high, keening wail of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the sound of a mother wolf finding her den raided. But in the room, there was silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. Stella's hand came up to her chest, gripping the fabric of her coat as if trying to physically hold her heart inside her ribcage. The pain of the infidelity was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy stone of hatred. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was war. Adam had crossed a line that no amount of tears or apologies could ever redraw. He had dragged Sarah, sweet, artistic, scatterbrained Sarah, into a felony. If Stella walked away now, if she simply filed for divorce and let the chips fall, Sarah would be dragged into federal court. She would be cross-examined. She would be destroyed. The law didn't care about naivety, it cared about signatures. And Sarah's signature was on a document that framed her own father for stealing millions. They had set a trap that would snap the spine of the entire Vance family, leaving Adam and Jimmy to walk away with the money, shaking their heads at the tragic criminality of their in-laws. Stella looked at the bed. The revulsion she felt was absolute. It wasn't the disgust of a wife looking at a cheater, it was the biological recoil of a human looking at a parasite. Adam wasn't a man. He was a disease. A rot that had infected everything she touched. She looked at Anna. Did she know? Of course she knew. She was the consultant. She was the architect. She was sleeping soundly next to a man who had just sold his sister-in-law down the river for a beach house in the Caymans. The tears that had been threatening to fall since she entered the room dried up instantly. They evaporated in the heat of her fury. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Grief was for people who had lost something. Stella realized she hadn't lost anything, she had just discovered what she was living with. And now, she had a job to do. She pulled her phone out again. Her fingers were steady now, possessed by a surgical precision. She didn't just photograph the screen, she engaged the video function. She scrolled slowly through the text chain, capturing every word, every timestamp, every damning emoji. She captured the casual cruelty, the premeditation, the specific mention of the lie told to Sarah. Life insurance. The irony was suffocating. He had told Sarah he was insuring Stella's life, while actively signing her death warrant. She saved the video. Then she took screenshots. Then she emailed them all to herself, to her work email, and to a draft folder in an old Gmail account Adam didn't know existed. She was building a fortress. A fortress of evidence that would not only exonerate her father but would shield Sarah. With these texts, Sarah wasn't a co-conspirator, she was a victim of fraud. With these texts, the narrative flipped. The family conspiracy became a predatory entrapment. Stella looked at the clock. 5:25 a.m. 5 minutes. The realization of what she had to do settled over her like a coat of armor. She couldn't just leave. If she left, she gave them a head start. If she left, they might wake up, realize the laptop had been touched, and scrub the servers. They might destroy the physical documents before she could get the police involved. No. She had to pin them down. She had to hold them here. She had to be the anchor that dragged them to the bottom of the ocean they tried to swim across. She looked at the sleeping form of her husband. She remembered the vows they had taken. For better, for worse. He had certainly delivered the worse. Now, it was her turn to deliver the justice. She felt a strange sensation in her hands, a tingling, a desire to do violence. To pick up the heavy crystal lamp and bring it down on his skull. It would be so easy. It would be so satisfying. But that was what a crazy woman would do. That was what a scorned wife would do. And Stella was done being the wife. She was the matriarch now. She was the defender of the bloodline. And matriarchs don't throw lamps. They throw gavels. She closed the messaging app. She minimized the windows. She left the laptop exactly as she had found it, glowing innocently in the dark. She turned her gaze to the documents on the vanity. The physical proof. The papers with her father's shaky signature and Sarah's looping, youthful scrawl. She reached out and took them. She didn't photograph them this time. She took them. She slid the folder out from under the laptop, careful not to disturb the balance. She folded the heavy legal paper and slipped it into the deep inner pocket of her coat. Let them wake up and look for it. Let them panic. Let the fear start to eat at them before the handcuffs even clicked. She checked her pocket. Phone. Flash drive. Documents. She had the weapon. She had the ammunition. She had the map. The innocent accomplice was safe as long as Stella played this next part perfectly. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes dark circles of exhaustion, but there was something new in the set of her jaw. A hardness. A steel that hadn't been there yesterday. She wasn't Stella, the doting wife. She was Stella, the witness. And she was about to take the stand. She turned away from the mirror and looked at the bed. The time for lurking was over. The time for silence was ending. The sun was pressing against the curtains, demanding entry. It was time to wake the dead. There were 8 minutes left. In the grand tapestry of a 7-year marriage, 8 minutes was a microscopic thread, a blink of an eye, a pause for breath. But in the cold, blue silence of this bedroom, 8 minutes was an eternity of opportunity. It was the difference between being a victim and being a victor. Stella stood in the center of the room, her heart no longer a frantic bird, but a steady, heavy pendulum. She felt a strange, ethereal detachment, as if she were a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. She moved. Her feet knew every inch of this floor. She knew which floorboards groaned under the weight of a footstep and which remained silent. She knew the exact angle to turn the vanity chair so it wouldn't scrape against the hardwood. This house, which she had curated with such love, was now her tactical environment. She was using her intimacy with the space as a weapon against the people who had violated it. She returned to the vanity, her phone held with the steady grip of a surgeon. She didn't just take pictures anymore, she was building a dossier. She opened the leather folder again, her fingers hovering over her father's forged signature. The sight of it, the shaky, elegant script of a man who had taught her how to ride a bike and how to respect the truth, felt like a hot needle in her eye. She took a high-resolution photo, the flash disabled, the shutter sound silenced. Then, she moved to the witness line where Sarah's name was written in her bubbly, youthful hand. Click. The image was crisp. Indisputable. She felt a wave of protective fury, a primal urge to shield her sister from the fallout of this signature. She took photos of every page, every clause, every addendum. She was documenting the sale of her family's soul. Next, she turned her attention back to the laptop. She didn't have time to download everything, so she used the video function on her phone. She started at the top of the spreadsheet, Project Horizon, and scrolled slowly, capturing the dates, the amounts, and the destination accounts in the Caymans. She moved to the email thread with Jimmy, recording the cold, calculated messages about handling Arthur and using Sarah. As she recorded, she watched the progress bar on her phone. It felt like she was draining the lifeblood out of Adam's future. Every megabyte of data was a year of his freedom. Every pixel was a brick in the wall of his eventual prison cell. She felt no joy in it, only a grim, mechanical satisfaction. This was the work of a ghost, invisible, silent, and absolute. On the bed, Adam shifted. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Stella froze, her phone halfway through a scroll. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She watched him through the reflection in the vanity mirror. He rolled onto his side, his back now toward her, his arm falling away from Anna. Anna murmured something, a soft, dreaming sound, and pulled the silk duvet higher around her shoulders. Stella waited for 10 seconds. 20. 30. Her muscles ached from the tension, but she remained a shadow. When their breathing settled back into a rhythmic, heavy cadence, she resumed her work. She had 4 minutes left. She opened her email app on her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, a blur of practiced motion. She attached the photos of the physical documents. She attached the videos of the digital trail. She attached the screenshots of the texts. In the to field, she typed the name of the only person she could trust, Benjamin Henderson. Ben was the Vance family's lawyer, a man who had known her father for 40 years and who had always looked at Adam with a slight, indiscernible squint of suspicion. Subject: urgent, evidence of fraud and forgery. Body: Ben, I am in the house. Adam and Anna are here. Attached is proof of embezzlement from the firm and the forgery of my father's and Sarah's signatures. They are planning to flee to the Caymans today. Please secure the firm's servers and notify the authorities immediately. I have the physical folder. I am staying until they wake up. Do not call me. Just act. She hit send. The little paper airplane icon flickered and vanished. A second later, she sent a duplicate email to a tip line for the Financial Crimes Division of the police, a contact she had looked up in the frantic minutes of Chapter 4. It was done. The signal had been sent. The machinery of justice, slow as it might be, was now grinding into gear. Stella felt a sudden, lightheadedness. The weight of the secret was gone, but the weight of the reality was settling in. She was no longer just a woman who had been cheated on. She was a whistleblower. An informant. She had just destroyed the man she had loved for nearly a decade. She had dismantled the life they had built together. She looked around the room one last time as a wife. She saw the wedding photo on the wall, the two of them on a beach in Maui, looking young and invincible. She looked at the vase of dried roses from their 5th anniversary. She looked at the bookshelf filled with the novels they had read to each other on rainy Sunday afternoons. All of it was ash. She realized that Adam hadn't just cheated on her, he had used their entire life as a prop. The home, the marriage, the doting husband, persona, it was all just camouflage for the predator underneath. He didn't love the life they built, he loved the cover it provided. She felt a pang of intense, hollow sadness. It wasn't for Adam, but for the version of herself that had existed yesterday. The woman who believed in forever. The woman who thought she was safe. She wanted to reach out and touch that woman's shoulder, to warn her, to comfort her. But that woman was gone, replaced by this cold, surgical ghost. 2 minutes left. Stella closed the laptop. She wiped the surface of the leather folder with the edge of her sleeve, ensuring no stray fingerprints remained. She slid the folder into the deep, hidden pocket of her trench coat. It felt heavy against her hip, a physical weight of truth. She checked the floor. The lilies she had dropped were still there, a white stain on the dark carpet. She left them. They were her calling card. A silent message that she had been there, that she had seen, and that she was no longer the person they thought she was. She moved toward the door, her steps as light as a whisper. She didn't look back at the bed. She didn't need to. The image was etched into her mind, a permanent scar. She stepped out into the hallway, the air here cooler and fresher than the stale, perfume-heavy air of the bedroom. She walked toward the guest room, but then stopped. No. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't wait in the shadows like a coward. She walked down the stairs, her hand trailing on the banister. She went into the kitchen. The house was starting to brighten as the sun climbed higher. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved to the stove and filled the kettle. The sound of the running water felt normal, a mundane act in the middle of a massacre. She set the kettle on the burner. She took out a single porcelain cup, her favorite one, with the gold rim. She sat down at the kitchen island, facing the stairs. She checked her watch. 5:30 a.m. High above her, in the room she used to call her sanctuary, the alarm began to beep. A persistent, rhythmic chirping that heralded the end of the world. Stella sat perfectly still, her hands wrapped around the empty cup, her eyes fixed on the doorway. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a witness. And the trial was about to begin. It wasn't the soft, melodic chime of a peaceful morning, but the persistent, high-pitched chirping of an iPhone alarm, a sound specifically engineered to pierce through the thickest fog of sleep. In the context of a normal Tuesday, it was the mundane herald of coffee and commutes. But at 5:15 a.m., in a room thick with the scent of a stranger's perfume and the heavy, stagnant air of betrayal, it sounded like a death knell. It was the rhythmic ticking of a bomb that had already detonated, though the inhabitants of the bed didn't know it yet. Stella didn't flinch when the noise started. She sat in the velvet armchair at the foot of the bed, her back as straight as a blade. She was no longer a ghost, she was an icon of cold, unforgiving reality. She had traded her coat for a stillness that was far more imposing. In her hands, she held a porcelain cup of tea. The steam had long since stopped rising, the liquid now cold and bitter, but she held it with a delicate, terrifying precision. Her eyes were fixed on the tangle of limbs beneath the duvet, watching the first stirrings of the wreckage. Adam groaned, the sound muffled by the pillow. It was a familiar, domestic sound, the protest of a man who worked too hard, or so she had once believed. His arm, thick and tanned, emerged from the sheets, reaching blindly for the nightstand. His fingers fumbled with the phone, the screen illuminating his face for a fleeting second, casting harsh, electronic shadows into the hollows of his eyes. With a practiced, lazy grace, he hit the snooze button. The chirping stopped, plunging the room back into a silence so heavy it felt subterranean. As he withdrew his hand, his arm draped naturally, possessively, over the woman beside him. His fingers brushed Anna's shoulder, a casual gesture of intimacy that spoke of a deep, established comfort. He didn't pull away. He didn't jump in guilt. Even in his half-conscious state, his body recognized her. He nuzzled into the back of her neck, inhaling her scent, the scent that wasn't Stella's, and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Then, he opened his eyes. At first, there was only the blur of the room. He blinked against the gray light of the dawn, his mind still tethered to the easy warmth of the bed. He looked toward the foot of the bed, perhaps expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the trunk or the discarded robe he had used to lure Anna into his space. Instead, he saw her. Stella sat perfectly framed by the window behind her, the rising sun beginning to bleed a pale, sickly yellow across her shoulders. She was fully dressed in the charcoal suit she had worn to her mother's house, her hair pulled back in a knot so tight it looked painful. She looked like a portrait of a Victorian widow, except there was no grief in her expression, only a vast, echoing vacuum of emotion. The transition in Adam's face was a study in human terror. It began with a slow, confused furrowing of his brow, a cognitive glitch as his brain tried to reconcile the woman in the chair with the woman who was supposed to be 60 miles away. Then, the blood drained from his skin, leaving him a ghastly, translucent white. The hand that had been resting on Anna's shoulder began to tremble, then jerked back as if he had touched a live wire. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The air in his lungs seemed to have turned to lead. Beside him, Anna stirred, roused by his sudden, violent movement. She turned over, rubbing her eyes, her voice a low, sleep-heavy murmur of a name that wasn't Stella's. She sat up, the silk sheet slipping down, her dark hair a chaotic curtain around her face. She followed Adam's paralyzed gaze to the foot of the bed. The silence in the room was no longer quiet. It was a roar. Stella didn't move a muscle. She didn't lower the teacup. She didn't blink. She simply watched them, her gaze moving from Adam to Anna with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly repulsive specimen of bacteria. She saw the way Anna's eyes widened, the way her hand flew to her throat, the way she tried to pull the duvet up to cover her nakedness, a modesty that was as insulting as it was late. Stella, Adam finally choked out. The name sounded foreign in his mouth, a word from a language he no longer had the right to speak. His voice was thin, cracking under the weight of the atmosphere. Stella didn't answer. She didn't scream. She didn't hurl the cold tea at his face. She simply tilted her head, a fraction of an inch, acknowledging his existence without granting him the mercy of a response. The 15 minutes she had spent in the shadows were now the foundation of her power. She knew about the Caymans. She knew about the forged signatures. She knew about Sarah and the insurance policy. She knew about Jimmy and the villa in Osprey. She knew every dirty, jagged secret they thought they had buried under these very sheets. And she knew that in his head, Adam was currently frantically trying to build a lie, a bridge of words to get him from this bed to her forgiveness. She watched him try. She saw the gears turning behind his eyes, the lawyer's mind desperately searching for a loophole, a narrative, a way to blame the wine or the stress or her absence. She saw the moment he decided on a tactic, the guilty, broken husband defense. He took a breath, his face twisting into a mask of feigned agony. Stella raised the teacup to her lips. She didn't drink. She just held it there, a silent command for him to remain quiet. The power dynamic of the room had shifted so violently that the air felt thin. Adam, the man who commanded courtrooms and boardroom tables, looked small. He looked naked, and not in the way he had been moments ago. He was stripped of his charm, his status, and his lies. He was just a thief caught with his hands in the safe. Anna began to scramble out of the bed, her movements frantic and undignified. She was looking for her clothes, for an exit, for anything other than the laser focus of Stella's eyes. She stumbled over the fallen lilies on the carpet, the white petals bruising under her bare feet. Stella's gaze followed her, never wavering. "Don't," Stella said. It was the first word she had spoken, and it hit the room like a physical blow. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a mountain. Anna froze, one arm halfway into the silk robe, Stella's robe. She looked at Stella, her face a mask of panicked entitlement. Stella lowered the teacup. She set it on the small table beside the chair with a soft, final clink. The sound was the end of the conversation before it had even begun. She looked back at Adam. He was watching her, his eyes darting to the door, then back to her. He was realizing that she wasn't just there to catch him. She was there to witness his destruction. The calm on her face wasn't the calm of peace, it was the calm of a storm that had already passed through, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. The alarm on the phone, forgotten on the nightstand, began its second cycle of chirping. Adam reached out to silence it again, but his hand stopped mid-air. He looked at the phone, then at Stella. The phone was a reminder of the time. The time he was supposed to be leaving. The time he was supposed to be finalized his theft. Stella smiled. It was a small, ghost of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're going to be late, Adam," she said, her voice smooth and cold as a frozen lake. The horror in his eyes deepened as the realization finally took root. She didn't just know he was in bed with another woman. She knew where he was supposed to be going. And she knew he was never going to get there. The 15 minutes were over. The truth had arrived, and it was much colder than the dawn. The silence of the room was finally punctured by the frantic, scraping sounds of Anna's panic. She moved with an undignified desperation, her hands tangling in the silk duvet as she tried to reconstruct a sense of modesty that had been discarded hours ago. She played the part of the guilty mistress, with a practiced, cinematic flair, eyes wide and brimming with tears, a hand clutched to her chest, her voice a series of stuttered, half-formed apologies that were meant to sound like regret but felt like a script. She was performing for an audience of one, hoping that by appearing small and shattered, she could deflect the cold, crystalline radiation of Stella's gaze. She avoided looking at the fallen lilies, she avoided looking at the vanity where her secrets had been raided. She was a bird trapped in a cage of her own making, fluttering against bars made of Stella's silence. Beside her, Adam had finally found his voice, though it was not the voice of the man Stella had married. It was the voice of a defendant. He sat up, the shadows of the room clinging to the hollows of his collarbone, his face a shifting mask of curated remorse. He began with the lawyer's tongue, a smooth, rhythmic cadence designed to soothe and manipulate. He spoke of the stress of the firm, the unbearable weight of the recent mergers, and the bottles on the nightstand that had clouded his judgment. He reached out a hand toward Stella, a gesture of supplication that looked grotesque in the morning light, and tried to weave a narrative where this tawdry betrayal, was merely a momentary lapse, a glitch in the software of their perfect life. He was gaslighting her with the precision of a master. He suggested that if she had been home more, if she hadn't been so consumed by her mother's illness, perhaps they wouldn't be in this position. He tried to frame his infidelity as a tragedy they had both authored, a communal failure of their vows. He was looking for a crack in her armor, a flicker of the soft Stella he thought he knew, the woman who forgave, the woman who smoothed over the rough edges of his ego, the woman who believed his lies because the truth was too heavy to carry. Stella watched him. She didn't blink as he poured out his rehearsed contrition. She didn't interrupt the flow of his excuses, letting the words pile up like dead leaves in the center of the room. She felt a profound sense of revulsion, not just for his actions, but for the sheer laziness of his deception. He thought she was still playing the game of husband and wife. He didn't realize that she had already flipped the board. "Stop," she said. The word wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It was a flat, horizontal line that cut through his monologue like a wire through clay. Adam paused, his hands still suspended in the air, his mouth open as he prepared his next rationalization. He looked at her, his eyes searching for the tears, the heartbreak, the spicy drama of a woman scorned. But Stella's eyes were as dry as bone and as cold as deep-sea water. "You're talking about the wrong thing, Adam," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "I don't care about the wine. I don't care about the stress. And I certainly don't care about the woman wearing my robe." Anna flinched at the mention of the robe, her fingers tightening on the silk. Adam's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. This wasn't the script. The wife was supposed to cry about the mistress. The wife was supposed to ask, why her, or how long? "I want to talk about Vantage Holdings," Stella continued, her voice taking on a surgical, rhythmic quality. "I want to talk about the $80,000 moved to the Caymans on Tuesday. I want to talk about the villa in Osprey and why your name, and hers, are on the deed of a house in a non-extradition country." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Adam's hand dropped to the mattress. The color, which had been slowly returning to his face during his speech, began to drain away again, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. The remorseful husband mask slipped, revealing the terrified predator underneath. Stella didn't stop. She didn't give him room to breathe. She began to list the items of his destruction with the cold efficiency of a court clerk. She mentioned Jimmy and the Project Horizon spreadsheets. She mentioned the consultancy fees that were nothing more than laundered embezzlement. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the reality he had spent 18 months building. "But mostly," Stella said, her voice finally darkening with a hint of the rage she had been suppressing, "I want to talk about my father. I want to talk about how you stood in his kitchen and stole the roof over his head. I want to talk about how you used Sarah, how you tricked a 22-year-old girl into signing her father's death warrant under the guise of an insurance policy." Adam's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning but was refusing to fall. The sheer scale of what she knew was paralyzing him. He looked at the vanity, and then at the laptop, realizing for the first time that the 15 minutes he had spent sleeping were the minutes his life had ended. Beside him, Anna had stopped playing the guilty mistress. Her face had hardened into something sharp and ugly. She looked at Adam, not with love, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a business partner watching a sinking ship. She realized that the exit strategy was no longer an exit, it was a cage. "You thought I was the weak link, Adam," Stella said, standing up from the chair. The motion was slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. "You thought that because I loved you, I was blind. You thought that because I cared for my family, I was a target. You built a house of cards on top of my father's life and my sister's innocence, and you expected me to be the one to hold it up." She walked toward the bed, stopping just out of reach. She looked down at him, the man she had once thought was her soulmate, and saw nothing but a hollow shell of greed and cowardice. "The police are already at Jimmy's house," she lied, her voice steady and convincing. She knew Ben would have made the call by now, and the weight of that certainty made the lie feel like a prophecy. "The digital trail from the laptop is already with the Financial Crimes Division." "The physical folder? The one with the forgeries?" "It's in a safe place, far away from this room." Adam finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, high-pitched rasp. "Stella, we can fix this. We can move the money back. It was for us. For our future. The us felt like a slur. Stella felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust. He was still trying to use their marriage as a shield. He was still trying to make her an accomplice in his own salvation. There is no us, Adam, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than any shout. There is only the truth. And the truth is that you are a thief, a liar, and a coward. You didn't just break my heart. You tried to erase my family. She turned her gaze to Anna, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and defiance. And you, Stella said, her voice dripping with a cold, elegant venom. You thought you were the architect. You thought you were the one who would get the villa and the money. But in the eyes of the law, you're just a line item in a fraud case. You're not a queen, Anna. You're evidence. Stella stepped back, moving toward the door. The sun was now fully in the room, illuminating every wrinkle in the sheets, every stain on the carpet, every flaw in the two people on the bed. The spicy affair had been stripped of its glamour, leaving only the rot of a crime. Adam tried to get out of bed, to follow her, to grab her arm, but his legs seemed to have failed him. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his head in his hands, the image of a man who had realized that his exit strategy had led him directly into a dead end. Stella didn't look back. She didn't need to. The gaslighting had failed. The lies had dissolved. All that was left was the 15-minute truth that had destroyed them both. She walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the hallway like a countdown, leaving the two betrayers to face the cold, unforgiving light of the day they had worked so hard to outrun. The air in the bedroom, once heavy with the cloying sweetness of betrayal and the stagnant heat of sleep, suddenly felt thin, as if the vacuum of the truth was sucking the life out of the space. Stella stood in the doorway, her silhouette a sharp, dark anchor against the encroaching brightness of the hallway. She looked at the two people on the bed, people who had spent 18 months meticulously constructing a fortress of lies, and saw that the walls were not made of stone, but of ash. They were breathing in the soot of their own destruction, and the realization was finally, mercifully, beginning to choke them. Stella didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. The quietness of her revelation was far more devastating than any scream could have been. She spoke of the reality that was currently unfolding miles away, in the manicured suburbs where Jimmy O'Connell lived. She described, with a hauntingly calm precision, the sight of blue and red lights flashing against Jimmy's white picket fence. She spoke of the warrants being served, the servers being seized, and the look on Jimmy's face when he realized that the clean, witness signatures he had bragged about were now the very evidence that would bury him. The truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. Adam's hands, which had been grasping at the air as if trying to catch the fading echoes of his excuses, went limp. He stared at Stella, his pupils dilated with a primal, animal terror. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore, he was looking at a predator who had spent the last 15 minutes sharpening her claws in the dark. The realization that the machinery of his ruin was already in motion, that the phone calls had been made, the emails sent, and the evidence secured by a lawyer who had never liked him, stripped away the last of his lawyerly composure. He looked small, a man-shaped void of ego and greed. But the most violent shift occurred in Anna. Until this moment, Anna had existed in a bubble of narcissistic delusion, believing she was the co-pilot of this grand escape. She had seen herself as the muse, the partner in crime who would sip cocktails on a balcony in Osprey while the world burned behind them. But as Stella spoke of the consultancy, fees and the liability structure, the scales fell from Anna's eyes with a sickening, audible clarity. She looked at the laptop, then back at Adam, who was still avoiding her gaze. She began to understand the 15-minute revelation that Stella had already mastered. The consultancy wasn't a reward for her loyalty, it was a paper trail designed to end at her doorstep. Adam hadn't been protecting her by putting the accounts in her name, he had been building a human shield. If the feds came knocking, it wouldn't be Adam Vance, the respected partner, who would be the primary target of the embezzlement charge. It would be Anna, the independent contractor, who had authorized the transfers. Adam had intended to walk away from the wreckage of his marriage and his firm, leaving not only Stella's family in ruins but Anna as well. The transition from lover to enemy was instantaneous. The guilty mistress act vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged fury that was as ugly as the betrayal itself. Anna lunged toward Adam, not with affection, but with the intent to tear him apart. She didn't use words, she used accusations. She screamed about the promises he had made, the papers he had forced her to sign, and the future that was nothing more than a well-decorated cell. The silk robe she wore, Stella's robe, became a mockery, a costume for a fool who had been played by a master. Adam didn't apologize. He didn't even try to comfort her. Driven by the instinct of a cornered rat, he turned on her with equal venom. The sophisticated, charming husband Stella had loved for 7 years was replaced by a man who snarled about her incompetence and her greed. He blamed Anna for the digital trail, for the arrogance of her spending, for the very presence of her laptop in this room. He looked at her not as a woman he had risked everything for, but as a liability that needed to be liquidated. The argument was frantic, ugly, and devoid of dignity. They were two thieves fighting over a bag of gold that had already turned to lead. They threw secrets at each other like stones, revealing the depths of their mutual contempt. Stella watched them from the doorway, her expression one of weary, clinical observation. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, the pride, the lust, the greed all tumbling into a chaotic heap of resentment. The spicy affair had been reduced to its base elements, two desperate people trying to save themselves at the expense of the other. As their voices rose, a new sound began to filter through the cracks of their cacophony. It started as a low, mournful wail, barely audible over the sound of Anna's sobbing and Adam's shouting. But it grew steadily louder, a rhythmic, pulsing siren that cut through the morning air with the authority of the law. The sound was coming from the end of the street, moving closer with every heartbeat. The argument in the room stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the dawn. It was the silence of the end. Adam and Anna stood frozen, their bodies half tangled in the sheets, looking toward the window. The blue and red lights began to dance against the ceiling, a rhythmic, strobe-like flicker that turned the bedroom into a stage for their final act. The sirens grew deafening, the tires of the police cruisers crunching against the gravel of the driveway with a sound like bone breaking. Stella didn't move. She didn't look at the window. She kept her eyes on Adam. She saw the exact moment his spirit broke. She saw the moment he realized that he wouldn't be going to Osprey. He wouldn't be sipping cocktails. He would be sitting in a sterile room, answering questions he had no answers for. He looked at Stella, his eyes pleading for a mercy she no longer possessed. "Stella, please," he whispered, the sound lost beneath the final, piercing chirp of the siren as the cars came to a halt. "Think about our life. Think about what this will do." "I am thinking about our life, Adam," she said, her voice a soft, final verdict. "I'm thinking about the 15 minutes I spent in this room watching you sleep. I'm thinking about my father's house. I'm thinking about Sarah's signature. And I'm realizing that the only thing this will do is finish what you started." Anna began to cry in earnest then, not the dainty, manipulative tears of a mistress, but the heavy, racking sobs of a woman who realized her life was over. She tried to scramble out of the bed, to find her clothes, to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The house was surrounded. The exit strategy had become a tomb. Stella stepped back into the hallway, giving the authorities the space they needed. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest. The anger was gone, replaced by a vast, quiet clarity. The house of cards had fallen, and while she was standing in the debris, she was the only one who wasn't buried. She heard the front door being opened, not with a key, but with the authority of a warrant. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the stairs. She heard the voices of men who had no interest in Adam's charm or Anna's beauty. Stella walked toward the stairs, passing the officers as they ascended. She didn't look at them, and they didn't look at her. She was a ghost leaving the scene of a crime. She walked down to the kitchen, where the kettle was still warm, and she poured herself a fresh cup of tea. She sat at the table and watched the sun finally, fully, rise over the garden. The noise upstairs continued, the shouting, the clicking of handcuffs, the sound of a life being dismantled. But in the kitchen, it was quiet. The truth had destroyed them, just as Stella knew it would. And as she sat there, the steam rising from her cup, she realized that for the first time in 7 years, she was finally home. The spectacle of their removal was quiet, a stark contrast to the violent cacophony of their unraveling upstairs. It was a procession of defeat, devoid of any cinematic glory or tragic romance. The police officers, professional and indifferent to the domestic drama they were dismantling, guided Adam and Anna down the front steps not as star-crossed lovers, but as detainees in a fraud investigation. The morning sun, now climbing confidently above the tree line, cast long, unforgiving shadows across the driveway, illuminating the dew on the grass and the stark reality of the handcuffs glinting at their wrists. Stella stood on the porch, wrapped in her trench coat against the lingering chill, watching them go. She did not cross her arms, she did not sneer, she did not offer a final, biting remark. She simply bore witness. There was a profound power in her stillness, a gravity that seemed to bend the frantic energy of the morning around her. She watched Adam, the man who had once been the center of her universe, shuffle toward the waiting cruiser. He looked diminished, his shoulders slumped in the universal posture of a man who knows he has lost everything. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look at the garden he had insisted they plant, or the car he had leased to impress his partners. He kept his head down, staring at the gravel, perhaps finally seeing the ground beneath his feet for what it was, unstable and shifting. Anna followed, escorted by a female officer. The transformation was complete. The consultant, the muse, the woman who had smirked in Stella's vanity mirror, was gone. In her place was a frightened woman in a wrinkled dress, shivering not from the cold but from the shock of reality. She looked toward Adam for a glance of reassurance, for some sign that their plan still had a pulse, but he was already in the back of the first car, staring blankly through the reinforced glass. The alliance of greed that had bound them together had dissolved the moment the cuffs clicked shut, leaving them as strangers sharing nothing but a criminal charge.